I love basketball. Basketball is my absolute favorite sport. I love to play it. I love to watch it. I'll even throw in a fantasy basketball league here and there. And it really gets to me when basketball season ends and you now have the off season when there's no basketball whatsoever. And I find myself watching some of these throwback games that they play from time to time. Now, a throwback game is essentially a game that had a huge impact, or it was one of those legendary games where a Hall of Famer player did some awesome feats, the game going down to the wire, sinking a buzzer beater, or scoring this many points, or blocking this many shots. These are the games that the commentators rave about. These are the games that current players still go back to inspire them and to instruct them on how to play the game today. You also find that these are the kind of games that the commentators will say, I wish that the players nowadays played like this. They played defense like they did before, shot the ball as well as they did before, or this and that. They always nitpick on the current players. But when you think about the church, it's easy to nitpick the church as well. It's easy to point out all the things that are wrong with the church. It's very easy to point out the terrible experiences that people may have had. And some of you that are watching, maybe some of you are those people that have had a negative experience with the church. Maybe something happened that caused you to walk away. Maybe you're indifferent. Maybe you have found yourself asking, is this it? There has to be more than just this building. There has to be more than these pews. There has to be more than someone pontificating every Saturday or Sunday morning. There has to be more. And I agree that although there's a lot of things that we can criticize the church about today, I think we need to throw it back. I think we need to take a look at what Jesus had intended the church to be and see where in history the church rose up and was at its finest. I think we need to throw it back so that we can learn about how the church can reclaim those fine moments and be even greater than before. And so I want to invite you to a conversation that was recorded by the disciple Matthew in his letter called Matthew after his name, in the 16th chapter of the letter of Matthew. He records a conversation with his disciples. Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and I want to take you to verse 13 of the chapter 16 in Matthew. It reads, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. Then he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, you are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you, and I want you to listen closely here. Now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock. And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. So Jesus is having this conversation with his disciples where he asks them, what's everybody else saying about me? And they say, well, this is what they're saying. They're saying that you are a teacher, you're a prophet. And then he asks them a very thought-provoking yet foundational question. He asks them, but who do you say that I am? That, my friends, is the quintessential question. Because I have found, and I throw myself in this as well, I have found that many people have their own definition of who Jesus is. Many people have actually created their own image of who Jesus is to fit their comfort, to fit their viewpoint. But the God and the Jesus of the Bible doesn't fit any of our cultural norms. The kind of Jesus that he says is this church is built upon is more than just someone who gives feel-good advice. He's more than just a guru. He's more than just a motivational speaker. He's more than just a miracle maker. He's more than just a prophet that says things that comes true. Jesus is more than that. I think Peter had it right when he said, you are the Christ. You are the anointed one in the original language. You are the anointed one, the one who came to take the sins of the world away, the one that came to walk in our shoes, the one who came to experience life just like us, not tainted by the life, but taking upon life as we have experienced it. Jesus, who suffered the kind of griefs, the kind of hurts and the pains that we experience daily. That is the one that we call Jesus, the Messiah, the Anointed One. He came, He lived, and He died for you and for me. This is what we call the gospel. And it's a beautiful truth. And so Jesus had to sift through these things so that His disciples would get it right. And this is something that we all have to get right as well. We all have to reflect on this same question. Who is Jesus? What is everybody else saying? What else is everybody tweeting about? What are people writing about? And then he asks, who do you say that I am? And if we get this question right, we'll get the question of church right as well. Following Peter's confession of who Jesus is, Jesus says that my Father in heaven revealed this to you. In other words, God had to reveal Jesus' identity to him. It's something that we don't naturally come to. It has to come from a supernatural source. Now, if you're searching today to find out who this Jesus is, I may suggest that you pray that God reveals Jesus to you. We can find him in the Word. He's there. You'll find him. We can share Jesus with each other. But notice when we get to this passage where Jesus says, I call you Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. This is a very interesting word play in the original language of Greek, because Peter does mean rock, but it's not the same rock that Jesus is referring to. You see, some people think that the church is built on Peter, the rock. But if you were to dig a little bit on what Peter actually means, it comes from the Greek word Petra, which actually means small stone. It's the kind of stone that is not strong. It's the kind of stone that you find on a path. It's like a pebble on a path. It's not the kind of stone that you would want to build anything lasting. It's not something that's foundational for anything to be built on. And so Jesus uses this interesting wordplay. He says, I'm going to call you little rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. So this rock that Jesus is building the church on, in the original Greek, it's Petros, which is referring to a large boulder, a huge rock, a foundational rock that they would use as a foundation stone for the buildings of the ancient world. This is the kind of rock that would be steady even though the weather would be bad, or even though things change. This rock would be constant, unlike the Petros, which could be kicked around, could be flimsy, and is not something that you would build the church on. Jesus had to have been referring to himself as the rock. Far too often I find that we build their idea of church on these little rocks. These rocks that have no weight, these little rocks being our preferences, these little rocks being our cultural preferences, these little rocks that have nothing to do with God, with Jesus. These are things that we can't build the church on. And I'm sorry to say that oftentimes the things that we have problems with the church about are those little rocks that we try to build church off of. But I'd like to suggest to you that the rock that Jesus is referring to, that he's building his church, he's building on himself. So when we go back to that question, who do you say that I am? In order for us to understand the nature of the church, we have to understand the nature of Christ. And when we study the nature of Christ, when we study his life, We see that Jesus was not about pomp. Jesus was not about flair. Jesus was a common person just like you and me. He was actually homeless. He relied upon the generosity of others to be housed and to be fed. Jesus came here not as a prince. He came as a pauper. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. He came to serve and not to be served. The Jesus that the Bible portrays is a Jesus that would talk faith and hope and into those that had no hope and had no faith. Jesus spent more of his time with the people that we would consider outcasts, that we would consider no good people. That's where Jesus was. Jesus was a healer. Jesus went and healed people, not just of their physical ailments. Jesus also healed those of their spiritual, emotional, and mental illnesses as well. And so this church that is built on Christ has to follow that same model. And the word church itself comes from the Greek word ekklesia, which comes from two words, ek and kaleo. Ek means to and from, and kaleo means I call. So if we were to put those two words together, it means I call out of or called out of. And this word is always referring to a people, not a building, a people, not a program, a people, not a musical preference, but a people. So a better definition of what church is an assembly or gathering of people called out for a specific purpose. And so if I were to put it this way, the church is a people that is called by God, saved by his power, and sent for his purpose. And so what purpose is that? Well, the Apostle John also wrote a gospel, and in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane before he was crucified, Jesus prayed that God would not take his people out of the world, but rather send them into the world to be his representatives of his love. In other words, if I were to put it simply, the church is a people that is called out from darkness into the light of knowing the love of God and sent back into the world to share the love of God, to be those same hands and feet that Jesus had when he was walking this earth. In other words, this church would be healers. This church would be servants. This church would be people that would go here and there, that would not stay in one spot, that would continually go to those that needed his help, that needed encouragement, that needed hope. The church is a gathering, an assembly of people to do exactly what Jesus did when he was here on this earth. And I want you to notice too, at the end of this verse where Jesus is talking about the church, he says, at least in the version that I read, that the gates of hell will not conquer it. But I'd like to suggest that a better translation would be, and the gates of hell or Hades will not withstand it. Because if we take the image of the first one, we think of the gates of hell assaulting the church. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I have ever seen gates attacking anyone. I think that it's actually the opposite. We actually see people attacking gates. So when it talks about the gates of Hades or hell notwithstanding the church, it means that the church, the assembly of people called out of darkness into his light that has a purpose of serving him, those gates will not keep those people out. And so the question we have to ask ourselves then is, what are gates for? Gates are for keeping people in and for keeping people out. It is a defensive structure. And the powers of Hades, the powers of hell, has to be referring to the devil and his angels. The Bible describes the devil as the prince of the air, as the troubler, the accuser, the prince of darkness, the one that is holding people in these prisons of sin. And so God, through his church, is using the church to knock down these gates and freeing these people who are suffering under the imprisonment and oppression of the devil. And we see examples of how the church functioned and worked in the first century. And in the first century, the church wasn't like the church today. very few people, most of the converts into Christianity were those from the poorer classes, former slaves. They didn't have money. They didn't have these fancy buildings that we have. They didn't have a praise team. They didn't have Hillsong music. They simply followed Jesus, loving others as themselves and loving God, of course, first and foremost. They shared all things. They made sure that people who were hungry were fed. They made sure that those that were naked were clothed. And in the first century, it was common to throw away children that you didn't like or want. And these Christians, as poor as they were, would take in these discarded children. They refused to attend the gladiator games, which pretty much was worship of blood. It was a blood sport. People just couldn't get enough of people getting killed and animals getting killed. And they sometimes found themselves being placed in those arenas and getting killed as well. But because of their persistence of valuing life, loving their neighbors as themselves, we saw that the gladiator games eventually got shut down. In addition, when there were plagues that ravaged the empire, instead of running away from the people that were sick and dying, these Christians instead stayed and took care of those who were sick, often at the cost of their lives. It seems a strange thing that the church would grow even though they were persecuted. It seems strange that the church would have a major influence if they were being fed to lions and embracing people that were dying of plague. But they took the mission of the church seriously at the cost of their own lives. The Bible refers to the people of God as salt. And salt doesn't just stay in one place. It's used to bring flavor and seasoning throughout the world. They're described as light that shines in darkness. And they shouldn't hide their light under a bushel. We shouldn't keep salt in one place. It's meant to be spread around. And far too often we find that in the modern church, we're just simply go into a building either on Saturday or a Sunday and worshiping, and then that's it. But the church is supposed to be every single day. It's supposed to be wherever you and I are, those that follow Jesus, that's where we are. And wherever we are, we make an impact for Him. We have seen that the finest moments in the church were when it was the least favorable to be the church. Whether it's persecution, or whether it's plague, whether it's because of terrible things like slavery and war, we see that the church's finest moments is when people stepped up and shared the love of God. That's what Jesus had in mind when He called the ecclesia, the church. God has called a people that love Him to knock down these gates of hell. What are the gates now that still need to be knocked down? There's still slavery that exists in the world. There's still human trafficking that exists in the world. There's still systems of oppression. There's still poverty. There's still persecution. This is where the church is being called to knock down these gates that are holding people prisoner. There are people that still need to see and receive the light and love of Christ. And the only way that that is going to happen is if the church became that movement again, moving and taking ground from the devil, not retreating into our places, waiting until Jesus returns. No, this church is a movement that is taking ground for God. I don't know about you, but if church was simply this, and if all church required was me to be sitting here, I wouldn't want to be part of it either. But what if God is trying to give us a greater vision of what church is? What if God is calling us to throw it back? Although I believe that we had our great moments as a church in history, I believe that the finest moments are still ahead. And I believe that God is calling you and me to be part of that. Maybe some of you have had a bad experience with church. Maybe some of you are disillusioned or indifferent to the church. I'd like to paint a bigger picture of the church for you today. Would you like to be part of the movement? A church that is about the Father's business. A church that is about knocking down these places of oppression and seeing people's lives transformed because they've been freed from drugs, freed from addiction, freed from fear. I want to be part of that church. What about you? I hope that you enjoyed that Project Atlas talk on the church, reminding us that the church is not a building, it's not a program, it's people called by God for God's purpose in this world. And one of the things that God has called the church to do is to help those in need. I know that a lot of people in our communities are suffering right now, but there is a way for you to help out. I encourage you to check out United Way. They are partnering with local communities to help those that need education, that need healthcare, that need job training skills. And if that's something that resonates with you, check them out, unitedway.org.